Chapter 3. Matthias Teague massaged the bridge of his nose and contemplated a vow of celibacy before he and his wife unleashed another agent of chaos on the world. But, Dad, Jacob sounded much younger than his 17 years when he tried to wheedle, there are people. Matthias made a point not to look over at the air docks, where the last of the surviving airships were rising away from the spreading warehouse fires. Their long, ribbed pill shapes seemed slowly graceful against the midday sky, sedate compared to whirling columns of smoke and fire. At least the view outside his son's jail cell was appropriate. Jacob, Matthias kept his voice deliberately calm, your mother and I love you, but you're smart enough to thank God for the bars between us just now. Matthias believed that his son knew he loved him. Unfortunately, at times like this, it undercut the sheer menace that a man Matthias's size conveyed. Jacob was as tall as his father these days, though he favored his mother's slender build. There wasn't a trace of fear in his sea-green eyes, and he took a step closer to the bars and said, instead, I didn't do anything wrong. Matthias tilted his head. Right. So say the bars. Jacob cringed a little at that. I didn't hurt anyone or burn anything. I didn't. Matthias frowned. You just wanted to see the Lady Day riots up close. It was every other one of the 100 hot-brained young goats who look and talk just like you who did all the wrong. Matthias made no effort to lower his voice, despite the dozens of other young men in the cells with Jacob. Only half the heads in the cell whipped around at Matthias's words. Half didn't react at all. Jacob and Matthias spoke Kernuic between themselves, so the others didn't understand the language of the people that they claimed to champion. Matthias didn't know whether he wanted to laugh or cry at that. 3 of the boys, 2 about Jacob's age and 1 older, came forward with tight shoulders and clenched fists. Their faces were smeared with soot and dried sweat from the fires. The eldest had red hair to match his temper. Oi, Pasquin! Come on this side of the bars and spout off. Matthias fixed the man with a level stare. I'm free, 'cause I don't chum the waters for sharks before I swim. And if I was your grandfather, you'd have learned some manners. I farm, fish, and sell my silk, while young goats like you throw fits and burn down barns. So I am free, and have money in my pockets to pay my son's fine, so he won't sit in the stocks. Call me a goat again, old man. Your boy's in here with us, and not outside with guards and cowards. Jacob, who had been silent until now, whirled on the other. Are you calling my Tass a coward? Jacob. Matthias did not keep his voice down now. He was the tallest, broadest man in the room. There were half a dozen other friends and family here to bail out their loved ones, as well as half a dozen guards watching the 4 cages. Every head in the room turned when the old whip-crack of command echoed through Matthias's voice. Every eye fixed on him. Jacob did flinch then. Matthias, as a rule, did not raise his voice, precisely because it attracted this sort of attention. At home, this constituted the final warning before serious punishment, and Jacob knew it. Matthias cut into the silence before either young goat could start butting heads. He had already gone and made a scene. He might as well try to salvage something from the wreckage. He spoke in Salisic, so that everyone in the room understood. You boys don't want to act dumb and turn a week in the stocks to worse. Ever been beat? They can do worse. You want a slave collar? Maybe you want a rope for the hood man. Right now you're in because you have to be. But if you keep burning buildings on Lady Day, keep making trouble because you're too proud of a past you never saw with your own eyes, and it can change. Matthias leaned in on the bars. The iron rods seemed tiny and frail when he took them in his large, solid hands. But you're not thinking with your heads, so I'll give you a better reason. I'll know if anyone lays hands on my Jacob. He fixed the redhead with a complete lack of expression. I'll know. Matthias twisted on the bars in his hands. One of the metal bars groaned under the strain. You think I'm scared? You think I'm scared, boy? My name is Matthias Teague. I run the mill in Aberglass. Come to my home any time, boy. Come and try me. Matthias fell silent, his own anger mostly spent. The blood drained from the red-headed boy's face, and he took a step back. He pointed widened eyes at Jacob. Your father's Math the Miller. Two other boys stepped up and raised hands. Mr. Math, don't worry, we'll keep him safe. Another prisoner shot the red-head a dirty look before adding, You'll pay the fine, sir. We'll look after him. Matthias didn't need to look around to know that every eye in the room was still on him, apart from Red, who stared at his feet. Well, Matthias thought, he'd already stepped in it. No need to wipe it about. Jacob was out of immediate danger, and as long as they paid the fine and left quickly, they ought to be all right. Not that it would save either of them from Mary's opinions on the matter when they got back to Aberglass. Matthias turned and went to pay the fine, and conversation started back up behind him. Red's voice was subdued. I'm sorry. Jacob sounded more embarrassed by his father than angry. You didn't know. Nah, not that, Red said. I'm feeling sorry for you. My task is getting me out, and you're feeling sorry for me, right? Because then you won't have nice, safe bars between you. The door closed on Jacob's groan. Robert Cooper leaned against a building and whittled while the crowded streets of Mount Lee boiled around him. He hadn't seen such a mixed crowd since he left An Dinas 6 weeks ago. Men, women, and children were dressed in Salis linens, Nemid silks, and pilgrim greys from all over the duchies. Actual citizens of the border city were easy to tell since their clothes were a mixture of all three. The clothing was the least chaotic thing about the city. Some people were moving as quickly as they could to get away from the fires at the airport. Other people tried to get out of the way of the people fleeing the fires. Both groups floated around people stopped dead in their tracks, staring up at the sky as the airships beat their way free from the fire's murderous updrafts. Then there were thrill seekers or the morbid who were fighting their way through all three crowds to get closer to the fires. In the middle of the chaos were poor townspeople trying to go about their daily lives. None of them came close to touching the Knight of An Dinas who walked through their midst. It wasn't the man's broad shoulders, powerful chest, or flat stomach that parted the crowds. He was handsome, with a mane of shoulder-length brown hair and golden eyes over a strong jaw, but looks from a heroic painting didn't part the crowds either. The streets were too crowded to give people a chance to see the gray tower of An Dinas on his lacquered breastplate. The knight walked down the street with his eyes straight forward, not even acknowledging the crowd. He moved like a mythical lion, all feline grace and deadly power, and people parted in front of him like water. The Knight of An Dinas refused to acknowledge the crowd, and the crowd agreed. Robert watched the knight's progress with his peripheral vision, not looking up from the knife and wood in his hands. Well, Cooper, he told himself, you've picked the perfect target for your first felony. Hope you survive it. Robert took a deep breath to steady himself. This had to work. It was going to work. He'd planned it all out. How do you sneak up on a knight in broad daylight? Don't. Let the knight approach you. How do you watch a knight without looking up? Peripheral vision was good enough to follow the gap he made in the crowd. How do you ready a knife without putting him on guard? You make it the most obvious thing about you. Robert smiled at was it a fish? And kept whittling. It amused him that he was using tricks from a court bar to slip past the knight's defenses. Preparation, placement, distraction would carry the day, or his criminal career was going to be a very short one. Robert grimaced. He didn't want to steal. He'd lived his whole life as part of the system, trained for too long to uphold the law, to break it and feel nothing. But this wasn't about the law. This was about more than Robert's personal sense of honor. It was about justice, and he was going to see it through. Sir Zedekiah Montblanc dealt with the ministry and the insanity in Mount Lee the only way that a proper knight should. He rose above it and made sure the peasants stayed out of his way. There was a blur of motion to a side that came out of nowhere, a flash of metal, a knife. Sir Zed knew a quick moment of fearful fire as the knife flashed inside his guard. Zedekiah sucked in his gut and spun while his near hand flashed down to sweep the blade and the other reached for the sword at his side. The actions faster than thought and hammered into his flesh through a lifetime of training. It wasn't fast enough. The knife flicked out inside his guard and he couldn't catch it. The attack came from less than a meter out, with no warning, and as fast as he was, it wasn't enough. Sir Zed had a sixth of a second of helplessness and pure mortal terror. There was no stab of agony, no puncture, just the fear, and a tug at his belt behind the dagger where his money purse rested. 2/6 of a second. That's how long it took for his hand to clear his sword to complete the block. 1/3 of a second forged the fear to fury, and his sword hammered down while he completed the turn. Some peasant was going to pay for challenging him in public. Peasants screamed as Zed's sword caught the light. The crowd parted in every direction, leaping away as tight as bodies would press, until Zed stood in a spontaneous ring of solid shapes. But the thief was not inside with him. Zed heard the jingle of his coin purse. The breath he'd sucked in fueled a crackling command. "Stop! Thief!" Everyone turned to see what Zed was shouting about. Even the man-at-arms in the thief's path. The thief dodged to the warrior's blind side and raced away right behind him, unseen. All the traffic in earshot stopped cold. The thief didn't stop, didn't even look back. He actually waved Zed's purse over his head in farewell as he raced away. "Get out of the way!" Zed shouted at the crowd, but the peasants just flinched back further. The crowd parted enough on one side for Sir Zed to catch his reflection in a store window, a tall, angry man in lacquered armor waving a sword. The weapon was not helping. He sheathed his sword, took a deeper breath, and shouted again for the crowd to part. This time, the crowd parted. The guard down the road took up a call. "Stop! Thief!" And the alarm echoed through the streets faster than any pickpocket could run. Sir Zed felt an angry grin on his face. The thief was a fool to steal from a knight, and Dinas enforced the law across the land. They were the knights who fought the public battles and caught the criminals that no one else could. He was doubly a fool to steal in public during the Lady Day festival when there was always trouble, so both town and country knights were present and on the alert. Perhaps the thief couldn't be blamed for his third error. He didn't know who Sir Zed was, why he'd been sent to Nemid this year. The thief was doomed. Robert Cooper's boots pounded on the cobblestones as he raced away from Sir Zedekiah, and it felt like he could leap into the air and skydance on the power of adrenaline and fear alone. The stolen purse seemed to weigh 10 kilograms in his hands, and Robert's back itched with tension as he waited for a blow to land. Robert dipped behind a town knight who turned towards Sir Zed's shout and nearly lost his race at the beginning when a plump woman with a chicken in each hand spun and looked as well. He didn't quite take a poultry to the head, but the birds clucked and flapped angry wings in his face, blinding his vision when he needed it most. Then he was clear and raced away. Robert's instincts yelled for him to bolt straight ahead, but if he did that, he'd get tangled up in the crowd. He had to stay loose. As long as people were moving about, there were spaces in any crowd, little gaps that opened and closed as people worked their way forward. Robert didn't run. He had to change direction almost every meter, and it wasn't quite a dance either, because he twisted and dashed too quickly for any fiddler to match. But Robert improvised his way through the crowd faster than the guards could react, and for the moment, he stayed ahead of them. The whole time, something gibbered in the back of Robert's head. It was one thing to know that you had a well-armed, justly angry, lifelong warrior chasing you down. It was another to know that the warrior in question was one of the most famous knights in all Dinas. Robert vaulted a handcart of silver moss melons, slamming it down to the ground with his weight. He heard the merchant who pushed it shout and fall back, but he didn't look. He was crazy to do this in the first place, necessary or not. Only the special judgment of the saints themselves would place Sir Zedekiah Montblanc in Robert's path at the particular moment when he needed a target. This was proof in Robert's mind that the saints existed, that they were watching him, and that they weren't done punishing him yet. Robert faded left and then right again, waving his way through a cluster of young couples about his age just to find a girl who came up to his waist, frozen and wide-eyed in his path. Robert was running far too fast to stop in time on the worn cobblestones, and an impact would injure the girl and doom Robert for sure. The answer flared up from Robert's childhood training. An instinct older than Andinas reached out of the past and moved his muscles without thought. Robert leapt as high as he could, grabbed for his knees, and somersaulted through the air over her head. He landed, rolled, and resumed his running as the crowd shouted in shock. Some actually applauded behind him, and Rob felt a nervous laugh slip out with the next heaving breath. Robert wanted to look back. How close was Sir Zed? How close was his sword? He couldn't defend against a strike he couldn't see coming, couldn't dodge reaching arms from his blind side. The vulnerable ache between his shoulder blades screamed for his attention, but it was the one absolute rule to Robert's chase. If he looked back, and a knight of Andinas saw his face, then he was doomed. Even if he was lucky, and the knight didn't recognize him as Robert Cooper of Grey Mountain, a knight would use his face, his description, and hunt him down. It was their training Robert shared. He'd planned his crime to deal with that training, and he had to stick to the plan no matter how badly his nerves shredded under the pressure. There were shouts behind him now, and more footsteps hammered at the street than Sir Zed alone. The local knights had joined in the chase. Robert kept his balance centered and tried to move faster through the crowd while the tension in his shoulders gathered with every step. Sir Zedekiah never looked away from the thief's back, and he was gaining. By the time the chase turned onto its third street, it was obvious that the thief had planned his crime. He wore the same gray clothes as the other pilgrims, and since Port Lee handled the airship travel to and from Andinas for the most part of two duchies, if the thief made it to one of the open squares, he could disappear in a sea of pilgrim gray. But quick as he was, the thief had just run out of luck. A pair of lawmen stepped out around a blind corner, right into the thief's path. The thief had no chance to avoid them. They'd timed it too well. Zed eased his pace for a step or two to better appreciate the catch. But the thief didn't even try to dodge. He hurled himself into the midst of the lawmen. There was a moment of confusion as hands grabbed and arms flailed. The thief grabbed right back, spinning as he did, and dragged one of the lawmen along with him. Suddenly the thief's spin stopped, but the officer didn't. He flew right over the thief's hip, pulled by his own grip on the thief's shoulders, and slammed right into his own partner. Upside down. All the thief's running momentum was transferred to the impact, and both lawmen hit the wall with a thud Zed heard 10 miles back. The thief ran the instant the projectile policeman let go, and he'd spun too quickly for Sir Zed to get a good look at his face. One of the knights behind Zed gave a breathless laugh. "Got him! Got him!" Sir Zedekiah managed as he wove his way through the crowd. "Are you blind?" "No," the knight shot back, "but he must be. He just turned down the wrong road." "Why's that?" "No exit, just Sir Derek's manor, and Sir Derek's guards." Sir Zed turned the corner to see that the road did dead end. A large 3-story brick building wrapped its arms around either side of the street, with 1-story brick wall and a heavy wooden gate. Whether the knight's assessment of Sir Derek's manor was true or not, the thief seemed unaware of it. There must have been 2 men standing guard, since one of them was crumpled on the ground in an uncomfortable-looking sprawl, and the other was trying to rouse him. Zed saw a gray-clad arm and leg disappearing over the top of the wall. "Open the gate!" he shouted at the guard. The guard still looked completely confused, but after one blink at Andinas on Zed's breastplate, he raced to the gate to throw it open. Zed didn't so much as slow down. Now that he didn't have to deal with the panicked crowds, he drew Pax Red from its sheath. It might be overkill to cut down a running thief, but in his experience, criminals were more likely to surrender than face a knight of Andinas with a sword in his hand, and he wanted this thief to surrender. The guard got the gate wide open enough for Zed to leap through sideways. The courtyard was surprisingly utilitarian for a nobleman. A pair of cloth banners stood on either side of the stairway, which was large but not fancy. one each with the national and duchy colors. Zed thought that the thief was foolish no matter how skilled, and now the criminal lapsed into outright madness. The thief sprinted flat out at the far side of the courtyard, not towards the manor's wide-open doors, but towards a doorless wall with boarded-up windows. Then the thief dropped into a foot-first slide and hit the half-meter-tall boards of a basement window. There was a crack of wood breaking and a flash of gray cloth before the thief disappeared into the darkness. "Oh, no, you don't," Sir Zed thought. He pointed at the manor's open doors and shouted for the knights to use them. "You stole from a knight of An Dinas, and it's time for you to learn what that means." Zed dropped into a slide, feet first, sword overhead, and followed the thief in. Zed whipped around in midair and landed on the balls of his feet, with the window over his right shoulder. It was an act of habitual caution. If the basement was a trap, the attack would come from the blind side there. The basement was indeed a trap, but it wasn't for Zed. Candlelit darkness wrapped around him as the smells of dirty linen and unwashed bodies slapped him in the face. The mechanical clatter of machinery whirred to a stop, while Zed's eyes adjusted to the darkness. A flare of bitter anger made Zed instantly wish they hadn't. The basement was a sweatshop. More than 50 women sat at heavy mechanical sewing machines. Their greasy hair was tied tightly back, and their clothes were tattered and dirty. Some stared in fear at Zed's sword. Others stared at the opposite end of the room, where an open door led to some stairs, which was no doubt where the thief had gone. The rest kept their heads down and shot nervous glances at the two large men with clubs who stood between the rows of workers. If any of the women were older than 18, Zed would lick his own boots. The girls pushed huge carts of cheap gray clothes. The girls pushing huge carts of cheap gray clothes weren't into their teens. Young or old, every woman in the room wore the same exhausted bags under their eyes. Their worn-down clothes had all been pilgrim gray, and the same iron shackles clinked around their feet. Zed's grip on Paxred tightened until he heard his knuckles crack on the sword hilt. The sweat house toughs started toward Zed with angry expressions on their faces. The captive women between the men cowered against their sewing machines, helpless to get out of the way. Zed raised his sword. "I am Sir Zedekiah of An Dinas. My order guards these pilgrims you've kidnapped and enslaved. I would like very much to kill you for what you've done here instead of giving your town the justice of a trial. So please, please fight." The slavers' weapons clattered to the floor. "Finally," Zed muttered, "some respect." Robert Cooper slid Sir Zed's money purse into the knight's saddlebags. Zed's horse looked back at him with a patient expression. Robert petted the horse's neck. "It's all right, Seeker. I'm just returning something I borrowed earlier." The horse pawed once at the ground and shifted her weight. Robert shrugged. "I don't have any treats with me this time, girl, but I need you to owe me one favor for all the times I fed you, all right?" Seeker pivoted an ear to one side. Robert grinned. "Don't tell Sir Zed it was me." Seeker's head whipped forward, ears forward, whipped around, ears forward, and an instant later, Robert heard it too. Boots on cobblestones, and Sir Zed's voice arguing with someone else. Robert looked around the heliograph tower stables. There was only one door close enough to reach at the rate Sir Zed was approaching, and it was the one he was about to open himself. Robert looked at the rafters. How often did someone really look up in a stable? Zed's voice was confident. "Be sure to double the watch on the town tower. We mustn't lose a fair trial for the sake of a lynching." Zed wouldn't need to look up on his own. If a single horse spooked while Robert was hiding up there, then he'd be caught. But there were other places overlooked, places that no one would think twice if a horse focused on. He eased past Seeker as quick as he dared without spooking the mare and raced for cover while the knight spoke. "Do you really think we need to worry about mob justice?" Zed pulled the door open. "We have to worry about vigilante justice of some sort." "Surely not. The local folk might thumb their nose at Lord Lee, but they wouldn't dare touch a tower with knights of An Dinas." "No? Sir Zed offered his hand to Seeker. Robert heard crunching and smelled the biting sweetness of fruit as the mare accepted Zed's gift with gusto. Tell me, Sir Stephen. Do I smell smoke in the air? What are you talking about? We only have two of these. Only have two of the three warehouse fires out. We're doing our best. We'll be lucky if the smoke clears by tomorrow. Well, I'm just a wandering knight of An Dinas, not a town knight like yourself. Maybe I don't understand what could get people so upset. I mean, half of Mount Lee are Salisborn, the other half are Nemedians, correct? Surely they've learned to live at peace by now. There was a sigh. Most days you'd be right, but it's not about getting along. It's about symbols. Lady Mary was the last prize bride, so the Nemedians view her like their nation wrapped up. Poets, wrestlers, and their nobles, they're big into loyalty. They treat living people like they were saints, relics themselves, almost like pilgrims. Sir Zed made no reply. Shock filled Sir Stephen's voice. You aren't worried about Nemedians. You're worried about Salatians. The relics are sacred to us. Zed didn't quite gloat. A Salatian noble enslaving Salatian pilgrims, girls and young women to boot. What if the crowd kills him? Sir Zedekiah, we may not be An Dinas, but Mount Lee follows the rules of law. Lord Lee would never hand a prisoner over to the mob or let lynching murderers go unpunished. Robert heard the indignation in Stephen's tone. So Lord Lee, the one unifying element in the town divided, must either shelter a slaver or betray his own rules. Either way... Sir Stephen swallowed audibly. Excuse me, Sir Zed, but I have to go. We're going to need more knights. Zed chuckled as Sir Stephen's footsteps pounded away into the distance. He started to check his horse's hooves. He groomed his horse with the silent rhythm of ritual. Robert Cooper didn't dare move. The slightest rustle could betray him to Sir Zed, and this time he hadn't scouted an escape route. True stillness was a learned skill, but he had studied his lessons for a long time. For all the training in An Dinas, it was a trick his father's court jester taught him that made the difference between freedom and jail, or worse. He focused on breathing, and slowly tightened and released muscles to chase the phantom ants out of his limbs when they wanted to move. It was a lot of work staying still. The smells of horse, dirt, and feed filtered through the pile of hay hiding Robert. Stiff and sharp edges of 1,000 straws poked at his flesh, his face. One had slid into his left ear. The constant tickle from that was its own brand of agony. Robert kept taking shallow, even breaths to keep still in the hay. He just had to wait a little longer. Every knight worth the name cared for his horse, but it was a ritual. Zedekiah would finish his ritual and go about his business, or he would take his horse or go. Either way, he would leave and Robert would be free. He refused to acknowledge that damn tickling straw for one more breath, and another. If he got through this without going to jail, he was going to treat himself to a long bath. But Sir Zed never finished his ritual. The stable door flew open with such force that Seeker reared beneath Zed's hands. Zed spun away on one heel before the flailing legs could hit him in the face. It was another knight of An Dinas. No, that wasn't right. The warrior's sash was gray and brown instead of gray and black. It was a squire. Sir Zed, the squire said. He's here. Alex, barring the death of the king or an imminent revolt, I'm hard-pressed to think of a reason for a squire of An Dinas to abandon all decorum. Also, you should know better than to burst into a stable like that. A lesser man could have been injured. Robert's brain clicked back into gear at the name. He hadn't recognized the squire at first because it had been years since he spent any time around him. But take the boy he knew, stretch him out to flat plains and hollow-stomached youth, and that would be Alexander Peterson, the third son of Baron Xander Peterson of Eastfield. Alex had always been short, and while he appeared to have been physically stretched to his adult height, he would never be more than medium tall. His voice had stopped squeaking in the 4 years since Robert had known him well. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. But it's urgent, sir. Zed stroked Seeker's neck to calm the startled horse. He didn't look over. Alex, there's a barely contained fire at the airport, a recently disbanded riot, and one of the most prominent local lords waiting trial for slavery. Which crisis did you mean? None of them, sir. Or, well, maybe the riots, but it was the jail that they held the rioters, that held the rioters they caught, and... Take a breath, Alex. A knight must communicate clearly in all circumstances, particularly when it's urgent. Quick and clear speech is a skill that saves lives when it really counts. Yes, sir. Now, what was so urgent that you spooked my horse? Succinctly, mind. Matthias Teague is in Mount Lee. He bailed his son out of jail about 3 hours ago. So, the famous Matt the Miller crossed the mountains. Sir Zed started grooming Seeker exactly where he'd left off. He spoke in a calm and soothing voice for the horse's benefit, but the words were for his squire. Well done, Alex. That is an opportunity. The local tower commander was just telling me how Nemedians love their heroes. Now their most famous wrestler is walking across our path. Alex snorted. Wrestler and rebel, you mean? Alleged rebel, Squire Alex. The formality reinforced the rebuke. We are sworn to uphold the law, and there's never been a shred of proof that the rumors about Matthias Teague. That the rumors about Matthias Teague are anything but. If we start throwing the appearance of law away, reality will follow soon after. The reality of lawlessness will follow soon after. No, Alex sounded excited. It isn't that interesting. I mean, Nemed was conquered 40 years ago, and they're still chaffed about it. They learned the lost cause from the womb. I could find some evidence on every man and schoolboy in Nemed if I looked, but there's none on Matthias Teague in our files on the region. Not a public outcry, not a civil disturbance, not a single word critical of the government. They ought to hate somebody like that as a sympathizer, but instead the whole duchy thinks he walks on water. He's too clean, sir. It's the best piece of evidence that the rumors are true. Zed chuckled. You're putting all the right pieces together, Alex, but his alleged nightlife is beside the point. Our local host was just telling me how devoted our Nemedian brothers are to their cultural heroes. If they threw riots over some 20-year-old murder, imagine what would happen if something were to happen to Mr. Teague or his son. But sire, there's no way someone careful enough to keep that clean would remain in Mount Lee a moment longer than necessary. Then we are fortunate that the riots have closed the airport, Squire Alex, since there is only one road over land from Mount Lee to Nemed. I want you to send a heliograph ahead. Our friends along the mountain road must make sure that no harm befalls our local hero. After all, Marshal Arsenio told me himself to make sure that no one from Salis fuels Nemedian insurrection. Tensions are running high in Mount Lee this Lady Day. There's no telling what could happen should some rogue element, furious about lost money or lost esteem from the Nemedian riots, were to retaliate against such a public figure. Or his son, Alex added. Indeed, you are learning to think like a proper knight. I had a good teacher, sir. Then why are you still standing here, Squire Alex? Make sure that our visiting hero has all the security that a man could want. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Alex turned and ran out of the stables as quick as he'd entered. Seeker whinnied and tried to rear again, but Sir Zed caught the horse's bridle in time. Wait, Sir Zed! Alex's voice came through the barn door. What did they resist? Send enough men to discourage resistance, of course. But if they are adamant, tragedies happen all the time on the trade road. Let Matthias go if you must, but I want the Teague boy, or his body, by week's end. Am I understood? Yes, sir. Then why are you still here? Robert remained frozen not 5 yards away from the most famous knight of their time, while his squire raced off to break the law.